So, the evolution of sensation and action. Look at the evolutionary history of sensation and movement. Remember that the cells in our body are all descended evolutionarily from bacteria and protozoa. Here is a section through a bacterium, and they have this fuzzy coat. Bacteria have a fuzzy coat, surface glycoproteins, which are their receptors that gather information about the environment. And in our bodies, the surface coat allows for information to pass from cell to cell and to connect with the connective tissue matrix. 1973, a neuroscientist, Jelle Atema, said this: movement is sensation in reverse. Sensation is movement in reverse. In other words, these motile bacteria sense their environment with their flagellum, and if they need to move toward or away from something, they use the flagellum to propel them. So this is both sensory and motor in nature. Remember that all mammalian sensory systems contain cilia and flagella, this type of structure. What Jelle Atema said in 1973 was sensory information is carried through this by conformational waves. He didn't know what he was talking about. He admitted that he didn't know exactly what that was. And then he said that the movement is the reverse of that when conformational waves travel out through the flagellum. We know a lot more now about what conformational waves are. One type is called the transverse optical phonon, where there's the side groups on a protein will move perpendicular to the direction of the wave, and then there's the longitudinal acoustical phonon, which is an accordion-like stretching and shortening along the length of the chain, kind of like a longitudinal wave that Constantine talks about. And then the same year that Jelle Atema was writing about this was the year that Davidov in the Ukraine published his articles about the soliton, or solitary wave. These are waves such as the tsunami or the tidal wave that show up in the ocean when a fault sinks at the bottom of the ocean, and because water is non-compressible, when the bottom of the ocean drops, the water drops and it creates a wave that is coherent. It's a spin wave, a coherent spin wave that can travel all the way across the ocean and produce a huge amount of damage. And the interesting thing about the Davidov soliton is that it does not disperse and it does not lose energy as it goes across the ocean. And this is a likely type of signal that's used in biological systems. Is an amoeba conscious? The amoeba can sense and respond to its environment. Candace Pert at the National Institutes of Health discovered that there are receptors for opiates, the same receptors that we have in our brains that respond to opium. These are bliss molecules, and they are present in protozoa. So it gives us an idea that perhaps single-celled animals might have emotions. Certainly the paramecium swims gracefully, avoids predators, finds food, mates, has sex, all without a single synapse. And Sherrington, the great British neuroscientist, said, "Of nerve there is no trace, but the cell framework, the cytoskeleton, might serve." He said, Hemmeroff said, If the cytoskeleton can be so useful in protozoa, what might it be doing in the highly organized cytoskeleton of neurons? Are neurons stupid in comparison with protozoa? Good question. So back to baseball. What can we say is going on here? A psychologist looking at baseball said this: there are two kinds of knowledge. Proceduralized knowledge, when your body knows how to do something. Declarative knowledge, when your conscious mind knows how to do it. I suggest that proceduralized knowledge is in the matrix. I suggest that Olympic gold medals are won not by training the nervous system, but by training the consciousness that the matrix has. And declarative knowledge is in the nervous system. Two kinds of consciousness. This is a book by Gerald Edelman, Nobel laureate, neuroscientist. The title is Wider Than the Sky, recent book on consciousness. And he distinguishes two types of consciousness: primary consciousness, relative of microbial consciousness, awareness of things in the world. All of our cells have this. They are aware of what's going on around them. And then there's this higher order consciousness that arose when the nervous system evolved. Awareness of being conscious, semantic or linguistic capabilities. Amoebas, as far as I know, don't know how to speak English or German. So the living matrix concept, I suggest that primary consciousness is present, as defined by Edelman, is present in every cell and in the extracellular matrix. That this system has a kind of consciousness, and then that the higher order consciousness is a property of the nervous system. There's a big problem. The neuron doctrine is in deep trouble. Many neuroscientists repress this information. Sir John Eccles, mentioned in the previous talk, Nobel Prize in 1963 with Hodgkin and Huxley. Sir John explained how sensory information and memories give rise to the conscious moment. This was his Nobel Prize work. The process involves the interactions between thousands of millions of nerve cells in the pyramidal cortex. Each cell has thousands of these synaptic boutons that interact with countless other cells. And the idea is that each cell polls all of the incoming signals. It sort of finds out, what is the story? Is it excitation or inhibition? Which is dominant? What is the dominant signal coming in from all the other neurons? The result is a decision of whether to fire and send a signal to other neurons or to remain dormant until the next pulling takes place, a fraction of a second later. And consciousness arises from the sum of all these decisions made in thousands of millions of these neurons in the cortex. In other words, the brain is a soft computer. When you figure out what all of the circuits are doing, you will understand consciousness. Tweety Bird helps me out. Are you sure about this? And there's a very interesting collaboration going on between neuroscientists and computer designers, seeing what they can learn from how the brain works to design better computers, and what better computers tell you about how the brain works. In the International Neural Network Society, this is their logo. The neuron doctrine, the brain's neurons and synapses are components in a computer-like switching circuit. Brain equals mind equals computer. Are you sure about that? Well, in 1993, Eccles concluded that his Nobel Prize model could not account for non-physical and transcendent properties of the mind, feelings, thoughts, memories, intentions, emotions. He suggested going to the quantum level. A neuroscientist friend of mine was present at the conference where Eccles said this. The neuroscientists were horrified. A whole generation of neuroscientists had careers built on working on Eccles' model, and he threw it out. Oh dear. Hameroff reminds us, individual neurons are more complex than switches. They have enormous capacity for intracellular information processing. The neuron doctrine ignores the fact that neurons are living cells. Cells are smart. Here's another statement from Edelman. The Greeks and others believed that consciousness and emotions reside in the heart. We now know this is not so. Well, maybe we don't know so much about that. Maybe that's not quite right. I recommend this article, The Electricity of Touch, from the Institute of Heart Math. Put this in Google, and you will go to this wonderful article. Heart Math has done a lot of very important work on the electrophysiological correlates of different emotional states, studying the brain waves. And there's a huge difference in the heart rate variability of a person experiencing frustration compared with appreciation. And this next illustration shows the harmonics of the electrocardiogram. And when you're feeling love, there are all these beautifully, nicely ordered harmonics, and when you're feeling anger or frustration, the whole spectrum becomes jumbled. Remember that this electrical energy, these frequencies are being conducted to every cell in your body. The indication is that every cell in your body, therefore, is participating in the emotional state through this energy that is coming from the heart. And studies with people who have had heart transplants and other organ transplants, as described in this book, The Heart's Code by Pearsall, transplanted organs bring with them a whole set of emotions which stick around for some time in the recipient. Candace Pert made a tape, Your Body is Your Subconscious Mind. This is the point I'm trying to make. What we call subconscious is not in the brain. The brain participates in consciousness. Subconscious activities are important, and the whole body is involved. She found that the molecules of emotion and their receptors are in every cell in the body. Then, other work, very recent work from the Institute for Heart Math by Roland McCready and colleagues, which is coming out in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Therapies in 3 different issues. Our research shows that the mind is constantly scanning several seconds into the future. This is an extraordinary discovery and is very well documented. Measurable physiological changes arise in the heart before the brain. Maybe the Greeks were right. So when is now? Now is elusive. Okay, consciousness lags behind what we call reality. It takes half a second to become conscious of something, but this is not how we perceive it. Outside of our conscious awareness, an advanced illusion rearranges events in time. This is from a Danish scientist who wrote The User Illusion. So we have a concept of now, and all the sensory inputs come together to create a conscious present, even though it takes different lengths of time for all those stimuli to be processed. He says, each second our consciousness reveals to us a tiny fraction of the 11 million bits of information our senses pass on to our brains. So just imagine all this information coming in through the sensory nervous system going to the brain, but most of the information from our senses goes to our unconscious, which I suggest is the entire matrix. All of those conscious cells. Trust your hunches and illusions. They're closer to reality than your perceived reality, than your thinking reality, as they're based on far more information. So here's a radical idea, maybe not too radical. Sensation is not what we think it is. We know from psychophysics that a stimulus, if intense enough, reaches a threshold and you're able to measure a nerve impulse in the sensory neuron going to the brain. So here's stimulus receptor signal to the brain. And I suggest that subliminal signals, in fact, right down to virtually zero in terms of energy, are, even though they don't get to the brain, enter the matrix. Subliminal signals enter the matrix, trillions of bits per second, and are stored and processed in the connective tissue living matrix system. I'll skip that one. So here are two models. This is the standard neuromuscular story, where stimuli affect receptors, which send signals via sensory nerves to the brain. If there's a choice to move, the motor nerve stimulates the muscle, and the muscle contracts. And there's a short circuit or bypassing the brain called the spinal reflex. The continuum model is that under certain conditions, the signal can go straight from the receptor to the muscle and create a contraction. This is how the martial arts master is able to move before this pathway has delivered any neurological signal to the brain. And how this movement takes place in muscles was proposed by Davidoff in 1973. He suggested that soliton waves traveling through the actin can create a sort of undulation, it's called reptation, that causes a sliding of the myosin and actin relative to each other, kind of the way that a worm moves through a hole in the ground. The waves go to the right, the worm moves to the left. And this came from the book of Pollack. So the continuum model, a direct connection from the receptor through the matrix to the muscle, much faster than the neurological pathway. And I suggest that this system explains how the baseball player can hit the ball, the martial arts master can defend himself, and the cheetah can go 110 kilometers per hour. So, in my opinion, this is my opinion, mind and consciousness include all of these things: sensory and subliminal perceptions, beliefs, the subconscious, the unconscious, intuition, insight, our traumatic history, dreams. All of this goes into the conscious present, or what Edelman calls the remembered present. And finally, I think we have an opportunity to research the subconscious in a biophysical way by looking at the circuitry. All of this if this is the tip of the iceberg, this is consciousness. I'm talking about the great bulk of reality that lies below the surface. It can be looked at as an electronic circuit. All of these phenomena that we've talked about in terms of biophysics may be keys to exploring the subconscious, the unconscious, and so on. Where we're headed with this, right around the corner, my favorite quote, there is this medicine and this method and that method, and then there is the way the body really is. So we are beginning to get an inkling of the way the body is, and it's been exciting for me to explore the athletic peak experience and try to pick out the clues that tell us about this other system. And I thank you for your attention.